The flames rose into the night sky as a quiet village in Ruthenia vanished in smoke. Among the terrified survivors dragged away in chains was a young girl whose name history would try to erase forever. Sold through the brutal slave markets of the Black Sea, she arrived inside the most powerful palace in the world as nothing more than property. But within the marble walls of Topkapi Palace, this captive girl began studying the system that controlled emperors and destroyed rivals. What followed would shock the Ottoman Empire itself, because the woman history would later call Hürrem Sultan was about to break rules that had governed the empire for centuries, and her rise would end with a prince walking unknowingly into death. The girl history tried to erase a quiet village burns under the night sky, and a young girl watches her world disappear in flames. What begins as a moment of terror will one day reshape the fate of an empire. But first, she must survive a system designed to erase her completely. Somewhere between the years 1502 and 1506, deep in the forests of Ruthenia, a place history rarely bothered to document, a young girl lived a life so ordinary that no chronicler ever wrote her name. The village was small, surrounded by endless fields and dark woods, where winter winds howled like distant wolves. To the outside world, it was invisible. But one night, that quiet world vanished forever. Flames tore through wooden homes as Crimean Tatar raiders stormed the settlement like shadows from a nightmare. Horses thundered through the mud, steel flashed in the firelight, and terrified families ran through smoke that swallowed the sky. Among them was a girl who would later be known to history as Hürrem Sultan. Her real name was Anastasia. It was the name her mother whispered when she was a child, the name spoken during prayers, the name that belonged to a life that no longer existed. By the time the raiders finished their work, the village had become ash and silence. Those who survived were dragged away in chains, pushed into a brutal human marketplace that stretched across the Black Sea. The Ottoman slave trade at the time was not random chaos. It was an organized machine, a network that moved thousands of captives every year. To the traders who managed it, these people were not individuals with pasts or futures. They were cargo. Anastasia's journey through that system was long and merciless. She was forced to walk for weeks with dozens of other captives, their wrists bound together with iron rings that cut into skin already bruised from exhaustion. The slave markets of the Black Sea coast were filled with the sounds of bargaining voices and crying prisoners. Traders inspected the captives like livestock, measuring youth, strength, and appearance. Fair skin meant higher value. Youth meant greater profit. No one asked her story. No one cared who she had been before the fire consumed her village. At some point along this road of captivity, the girl was given a new identity. Her Christian name disappeared from the records completely. In its place came a new name spoken in Ottoman Turkish, Hurrem, the joyful one. To the merchants who sold her, the name was probably a joke or a convenient label. A captive girl stripped of her past was now expected to smile and adapt to the world that had stolen everything from her. But the truth was far darker. Behind that name lived a mind already learning a brutal lesson about survival. By the time she arrived in Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, the transformation had already begun. The city itself was overwhelming, filled with towering walls, crowded markets, and the enormous palace complex where the Sultan ruled over lands stretching across 3 continents. Topkapi Palace was not simply a residence. It was the heart of imperial power, a labyrinth of marble halls, courtyards, and guarded chambers where politics moved quietly behind closed doors. Within its walls existed one of the most misunderstood institutions in history, the imperial harem. To outsiders, the harem was imagined as a place of pleasure and luxury, filled with beautiful women competing for the attention of a powerful ruler. But inside those walls, reality was far more complicated. The harem functioned like a political academy disguised as a prison. Hundreds of young women lived there under strict discipline. They were educated in languages, music, poetry, etiquette, and court culture. Every movement was observed. Every mistake had consequences. Most of these women would live their entire lives without ever being noticed by the Sultan. They would fade into quiet service, forgotten by the world. When Hurrem entered this system sometime between 1517 and 1520, she was just another enslaved girl among many. She wore the same clothing, followed the same rules, and lived under the same silent hierarchy that governed the palace. On the surface, nothing separated her from the hundreds of others competing for survival. But beneath that calm appearance was a mind that had already endured the destruction of everything she once knew. That experience changed her in a way the palace system did not expect. Most captives tried to survive by blending in, avoiding attention, and accepting the limits placed upon them. Hurrem did something different. She observed. She studied the behavior of guards, servants, tutors, and rival women. She watched how influence moved quietly through whispered conversations and subtle gestures. The palace, she realized, was not simply a prison. It was a battlefield disguised in silk and marble. And then, in September of 1520, something happened that would change the course of her life forever. The old sultan died, and a new ruler ascended the throne of the Ottoman Empire. His name was Suleiman. No one inside the palace could yet imagine that the arrival of this young ruler would soon collide with the ambitions of a former slave girl from a forgotten village. But that collision was already coming, and when it did, the Ottoman Empire would never be the same again. The palace that trained women to disappear. Inside Topkapi Palace, hundreds of women were trained to obey, compete, and vanish without leaving a name. But among them was one captive who had already learned the rules of survival. And soon, the Sultan himself would notice the mind that refused to disappear. The imperial harem of the Ottoman Empire was not the place of luxury and idle beauty that outsiders often imagined. It was a carefully controlled institution, a silent machine designed to shape women into perfect servants of the Sultan's world. Behind the thick stone walls of Topkapi Palace, hundreds of young women lived under strict discipline, watched constantly by eunuchs and senior attendants who enforced every rule without hesitation. Their days began before sunrise and ended long after the palace lamps were extinguished. Every hour was scheduled, every movement measured. For most of the girls brought into the harem, survival meant obedience. They learned languages such as Ottoman Turkish and Persian, studied poetry and music, practiced graceful movement, and memorized complex etiquette meant to impress the royal court. On the surface, this education looked like privilege, but in reality, it was preparation. Each woman was being trained to serve the empire's most powerful man. Some would become palace attendants. A few might rise to positions of influence among the women themselves, and an extremely small number might catch the Sultan's attention. But even that opportunity carried its own danger. Within the Ottoman system, the moment a concubine gave birth to a prince, her life changed completely. She would be sent away with her son to govern a distant province once the boy was old enough. The system was designed to prevent women from gathering too much influence inside the palace. Each prince was raised separately, with his mother far from the capital. Rivalries between potential heirs were expected, and the empire believed distance would keep those rivalries under control. The rule was clear and brutal. One prince would eventually become sultan. The others would die. Inside this environment of silent competition, fear shaped every relationship. Friendships were fragile, alliances temporary. Women watched one another carefully, knowing that a single mistake or rumor could destroy a future that had taken years to build. The harem was not simply a residence. It was a political arena where ambition and survival were constantly colliding. Hurrem entered this world as one of the lowest members of the hierarchy, an Adalik, a trainee concubine with no status and no protection. Yet even in the early months of her life inside the palace, something about her behavior attracted attention. She did not move with the cautious silence of the other girls. Instead of shrinking into the background, she spoke confidently during lessons, asked questions others were too afraid to voice, and laughed openly even when senior attendants were watching. For some, this behavior looked reckless. In a place where invisibility meant safety, drawing attention could be dangerous. But Hurrem had already lived through something far worse than palace discipline. She had seen her entire world burn in a single night. Compared to that, the silent games of the harem were something she could learn to navigate. Observers of the time noticed that her greatest strength was not beauty, although Venetian diplomats later described her as graceful and charming. Her real advantage was intelligence. Hurrem understood something many others missed. The Sultan was not simply a distant ruler, surrounded by obedient servants. He was a man who spent much of his life in isolation, burdened by decisions that affected millions of people across his empire. And in 1520, that man had just become the most powerful ruler in the Islamic world. Suleiman had ascended the throne at only 26 years old after the death of his father, Selim the Grim. Unlike his father, who ruled with relentless brutality and constant warfare, Suleiman was known for his intellect. He studied law, wrote poetry, and surrounded himself with scholars, artists, and thinkers. Even as a young ruler, he had a reputation for curiosity and deep thought. This difference would change everything. When Suleiman began visiting the imperial harem after becoming sultan, the atmosphere inside the palace shifted instantly. Every woman understood the stakes. Being noticed by the ruler could transform a life overnight. It could also place someone directly in the center of the empire's most dangerous political struggles. Many women approached the sultan with rehearsed politeness, offering the soft flattery expected from those seeking his favor. Hurrem did something completely different. When she finally encountered him, she spoke to him not as a distant godlike figure, but as a human being. She asked questions. She answered his thoughts with ideas of her own. She laughed easily in conversations where others would have remained silent. It was a small difference, but in a palace full of careful obedience, it stood out immediately. For the first time since entering the harem, Hurrem was no longer invisible, and that single change was about to set a chain of events in motion that would shake the Ottoman Empire to its foundations. Because inside the palace, there was already another woman who held the position Hurrem wanted most, and she was not willing to give it up without a fight. The rival who stood between her and the throne, in the shadowed halls of the imperial palace, one woman already controlled the future of the empire. Mahidevran Sultan, mother of the crown prince. And for Hurrem to survive, that future would have to change. Inside Topkapi Palace, power did not always wear a crown. Sometimes it moved quietly behind curtains, hidden in the private chambers where the women of the imperial harem lived and watched one another carefully. By the early 1520s, one woman already stood at the center of that hidden world. Her name was Mahidevran Sultan, and she held the position every concubine secretly dreamed of achieving. Mahidevran was the mother of Prince Mustafa, the eldest son of Sultan Suleiman. In the Ottoman system, that title alone carried enormous weight. The firstborn prince was widely believed to be the future ruler of the empire, the heir who would one day sit upon the throne of Osman, and the mother of that prince held influence that extended far beyond the walls of the harem. For years, Mahidevran had lived with quiet confidence. She had given the sultan a strong son, and Mustafa was growing into the kind of prince soldiers admired. Reports from palace observers described him as intelligent, disciplined, and charismatic. The Janissaries, the powerful military elite of the empire, respected him deeply. To many people across the Ottoman world, his future as sultan seemed almost certain. But inside the palace, certainty rarely lasted long. Hurrem understood the danger the moment she recognized Mahidevran's position. In the Ottoman system, every prince represented both hope and threat. When a new sultan finally took power, the law of succession was brutal and unforgiving. To prevent civil war between rival heirs, the new ruler was expected to eliminate his brothers. It was a policy known as the law of fratricide, and it had shaped Ottoman politics for generations. For the mothers of those princes, the rule was simple and terrifying. If your son became sultan, you would rise to unimaginable power as the valid sultan, the queen mother who influenced imperial decisions from behind the throne. But if another prince took power instead, your children would almost certainly die. There were no exceptions. Hurrem had already given birth to her first son, Mehmed, around 1521. More children would follow. Each birth strengthened her connection to the sultan and increased her position within the palace hierarchy. But every new son also made the stakes higher, because as long as Prince Mustafa lived, Hurrem's children remained in danger. The rivalry between the two women began quietly. There were no public arguments, no open declarations of hostility. Inside the imperial harem, conflicts were fought with patience and subtlety. A misplaced rumor could be more dangerous than a sword. A single whisper in the right ear could change the balance of power. Venetian diplomats stationed in Constantinople would later describe the atmosphere of the palace during these years as tense and unpredictable. They reported that the two women rarely confronted one another directly, yet the entire harem understood that a silent war was unfolding. Servants carried messages through corridors late at night. All eyes formed and dissolved with surprising speed. Every conversation might contain hidden meaning. Mahidevran believed her position was secure. After all, she was the mother of the empire's most promising prince. Tradition favored her. The structure of Ottoman succession favored her. And for generations, that structure had remained almost impossible to challenge. But Hurrem was not interested in following tradition. She had spent years studying the invisible mechanisms of palace power. She understood how influence moved through private conversations, through trusted advisors, through carefully planted ideas that could slowly reshape the thinking of even the most powerful rulers. And she knew that Sultan Suleiman trusted her in ways he trusted very few others. Their relationship had grown deeper over time. What began as curiosity had evolved into something more complex. Suleiman spoke with her about poetry, politics, and philosophy. He listened when she questioned him. In a world where most people treated the Sultan like a distant figure of absolute authority, Hurrem treated him as a man whose mind she could challenge. That difference changed everything. Gradually, Mahidevran's position began to weaken. Accounts from later historians suggest there were confrontations between the two women, though the exact details remain uncertain. Some sources claim arguments broke out within the harem itself. Others describe moments when the rivalry became impossible for the palace to ignore. Eventually, the tension reached a breaking point. Around the early 1530s, Mahidevran and her son Prince Mustafa were sent away from the capital to govern the province of Manisa, a common assignment for Ottoman princes preparing for future rule. Officially, it was a promotion. Princes were expected to gain experience by governing distant territories. But inside the palace, many people understood the deeper meaning. Mahidevran was no longer at the center of Suleiman's world, and for the first time, Hurrem stood closer to the throne than anyone had ever expected a former slave to reach. Yet even with her rival removed from the capital, the greatest threat to her future was still alive. Prince Mustafa was growing stronger with every passing year, and the empire loved him. The marriage that shattered the empire. For more than 2 centuries, Ottoman sultans followed a rule that seemed unbreakable. Concubines could bear princes, but they could never become wives. Until one day, Sultan Suleiman did something that shocked the entire empire. By the early 1530s, the atmosphere inside Topkapi Palace had already begun to change. The silent rivalry that once filled the corridors of the imperial harem was fading, but the tension surrounding Hürrem Sultan was only growing stronger. She had moved from an enslaved outsider to the Sultan's most trusted companion, a transformation that many members of the Ottoman court found deeply unsettling. The Ottoman ruling elite believed in strict traditions that protected the stability of the empire. One of the most important of those traditions involved the personal life of the Sultan himself. For centuries, Ottoman rulers avoided official marriages to concubines. Instead, they formed relationships within the harem, but kept those women outside the formal structure of royal marriage. The reason behind this rule was simple but strategic. If a sultan married a woman formally, her family could gain political influence within the empire. By avoiding marriage, the Ottomans ensured that no outside dynasty could interfere with imperial power. Concubines could bear children, but they remained outside the political hierarchy. This system had been in place since the reign of Mehmed the Conqueror in the 15th century, and for over 200 years, no Ottoman sultan had dared to challenge it. But Sultan Suleiman was already a ruler known for reshaping the laws of his empire. During his reign, he reorganized legal codes, expanded the Ottoman territories through powerful military campaigns, and strengthened the administrative structure of the state. Across Europe and the Middle East, he was known as Suleiman the Magnificent. Yet even a ruler with such authority was still expected to respect the unwritten traditions of his dynasty. That expectation would soon be broken. By around 1533 or 1534, whispers began spreading through the palace that something unprecedented had happened. Suleiman had not simply favored Hürrem Sultan above the other women of the harem. He had chosen to marry her. For many inside the Ottoman court, the news felt almost impossible to believe. The last time an Ottoman sultan had formally married a concubine was nearly a century and a half earlier, when Sultan Bayezid I married the Serbian Princess Olivera in 1390. Since that time, the dynasty had deliberately avoided repeating such an act. Yet now Suleiman had done exactly that. Venetian ambassadors stationed in Constantinople quickly reported the shocking development back to their governments. Diplomatic letters described the Sultan's decision as unprecedented, something that had shaken the traditional structure of Ottoman politics. Some observers suggested that Hurrem had somehow enchanted the ruler, accusing her of manipulating him through mysterious influence. Rumors spread rapidly across the empire. Some claimed she used magic. Others believed she had bewitched the Sultan through hidden knowledge or dark rituals. But these stories were more likely reflections of fear than truth. The reality was simpler and far more powerful. Suleiman trusted Hurrem in a way he trusted almost no one else. Their relationship had grown through years of private conversations and shared experiences. She had given him multiple children and had remained by his side while he ruled over one of the most powerful empires on earth. Unlike many advisors who approached the Sultan with careful flattery, Hurrem spoke to him honestly and intelligently. In time, that bond became impossible to ignore. By marrying her, Suleiman transformed Hurrem's status completely. She was no longer just a concubine who had gained temporary favor. She now stood in a position the Ottoman system had never truly defined before. She was something closer to a queen inside an empire that officially claimed queens did not exist. The political consequences were enormous. Within the palace, senior officials began to worry that the traditional balance of power was collapsing. If a former slave could rise to such influence, what other rules might soon be broken? Many members of the Ottoman elite feared that Hurrem's growing authority could reshape the future of the empire itself. But while the court debated and whispered behind closed doors, one reality remained impossible to ignore. Prince Mustafa was still alive. He was older, experienced, and widely respected across the empire. As the firstborn son of Suleiman, he still represented the most obvious successor to the throne. The soldiers admired him, the people respected him, and the administrative elite recognized his potential as a future ruler. And as long as Mustafa remained the strongest candidate for the throne, the future of Hurrem's own sons remained uncertain. Inside the palace, everyone understood the rule of Ottoman succession. Only one prince would survive to become sultan, which meant that someday the empire would face a decision that could change everything. And when that moment arrived, the consequences would echo through history for centuries. The prince who walked into death, Prince Mustafa, was brave, beloved by the army, and destined by many to become the next sultan. But in the autumn of 1553, a single summons from his father changed everything, because inside the sultan's war tent, death was already waiting. By the early 1550s, the Ottoman Empire stretched across vast lands from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. Sultan Suleiman stood at the height of his power, a ruler feared by enemies and admired by his people. Yet behind the strength of the empire, a quiet tension was growing that no army could control. At the center of that tension stood Prince Mustafa. Mustafa had matured into exactly the kind of leader the Ottoman world respected. As governor of important provinces, he demonstrated military discipline, intelligence, and confidence. Soldiers trusted him. Commanders admired him. Even many ordinary citizens across the empire spoke his name with pride. To the Janissaries, the elite soldiers who protected the Sultan, Mustafa looked like the future of the empire. And that popularity created a dangerous problem. Inside the palace, everyone knew the brutal rule of Ottoman succession. When a prince finally became sultan, he was expected to eliminate his brothers to prevent civil war. It was not considered cruelty within the political logic of the time. It was seen as stability. One ruler, one throne, no rival claimants. But that law also meant something else. If Prince Mustafa became sultan, the sons of Hürrem Sultan Selim, Bayezid, and the others would almost certainly face execution. The empire had seen it happen many times before. For Hurrem, this was not a distant political theory. It was a future written in blood, unless something changed. Whispers began moving quietly through the palace and the imperial court. Letters were written. Conversations happened behind closed doors. No accusations were made directly, but the idea slowly took shape in the mind of Sultan Suleiman. What if Prince Mustafa was becoming too powerful? Reports suggested that the Janissaries respected him deeply. Provincial governors spoke highly of him. Some soldiers even murmured that Mustafa would make a stronger sultan than his aging father. In an empire where loyalty to the ruler was absolute, such rulers were extremely dangerous. Suleiman had ruled for decades, leading campaigns across Europe and the Middle East. But time and war had left their mark on him. He was no longer the young ruler who had ascended the throne in 1520. Age brought experience, but it also brought suspicion. And once doubt entered the mind of a ruler surrounded by power and intrigue, it could grow quickly. In the autumn of 1553, during a military campaign against the Safavid Persians, the Ottoman army moved through the region of Anatolia. The Sultan's massive war camp stretched across the land like a temporary city of tents, banners, and soldiers preparing for battle. It was here that Suleiman made a decision that would haunt his legacy forever. He sent a message summoning Prince Mustafa to his command tent. To Mustafa, the order did not appear unusual. Princes often joined their fathers during military campaigns, and he believed he was being called to discuss strategy or leadership matters. Confident and loyal, he traveled to the imperial camp without suspicion. When he arrived, the atmosphere felt strangely silent. The Sultan's tent stood in the center of the camp, guarded by members of the Bastang Corps, the elite palace guards responsible for protecting the ruler. But these men also had another role, one that few spoke about openly. They carried out the Sultan's most final decisions. On October 6, 1553, Prince Mustafa stepped inside the tent, expecting to greet his father. Instead, he found himself surrounded by 7 silent executioners. They were trained not to speak, not to hesitate, not to question. Their orders came directly from the Sultan, and obedience was absolute. Mustafa realized the truth only seconds before they moved. The struggle was brief but desperate. Historical accounts suggest the prince fought fiercely, attempting to defend himself against the attackers. But the executioners were prepared. They used a bowstring, the traditional method of Ottoman royal execution designed to avoid spilling imperial blood. Outside the tent, soldiers waited anxiously, unaware of what was happening inside. When the struggle ended, Prince Mustafa, the most popular heir of the Ottoman Empire, was dead. News of the execution spread quickly through the army. Shock and anger rippled across the ranks of soldiers who had once admired the prince. Many could not believe that Suleiman had ordered the death of his own son. But the Sultan remained silent. Official records claimed Mustafa had been executed on suspicion of rebellion. Yet even at the time, many people doubted that explanation. Inside the palace and across the empire, one conclusion quietly took shape. The greatest rival to Hürrem Sultan's children was gone. And with his death, the path to the Ottoman throne had suddenly become far clearer. But the consequences of that decision were far from over, because the empire would never forget what happened inside that tent. The legacy written in silence. When Hürrem Sultan died, she was buried beside the greatest ruler of the Ottoman Empire. But the real shock was not her death. It was the empire she had already changed forever. By the late 1550s, the storm that once surrounded Hürrem Sultan had begun to quiet. The palace whispers, the rivalries, the silent battles fought behind curtains had mostly ended. Many of the people who once opposed her rise were gone, replaced by new officials who had grown accustomed to the power she quietly exercised within the imperial court. But the weight of the past never truly disappeared. The execution of Prince Mustafa in 1553 had shaken the Ottoman world deeply. Soldiers who once admired the prince had struggled to understand the decision. Some historians would later write that the empire lost one of its most capable potential rulers that day. Others argued that the event revealed the brutal reality of Ottoman succession politics. Inside the palace, however, the consequences were clear. The greatest threat to Hürrem's sons was gone. Her surviving children now stood much closer to the throne than anyone could have imagined when she first arrived as a captive girl years earlier. Selim, Bayezid, and Cihangir had grown into princes of the empire, each carrying the future of the Ottoman dynasty within their lives. Yet Hürrem herself never saw the final chapter of the story she helped shape. On April 15, 1558, Hürrem Sultan died in Constantinople at an age historians estimate between 50 and 56. The exact cause of her death remains uncertain. Some sources describe illness, while others suggest the exhaustion of a life lived under constant political pressure. Her death marked the end of one of the most unusual journeys in imperial history. A girl taken from a forgotten village had risen to become the legal wife of the most powerful ruler in the Islamic world. She had navigated a system designed to control and silence women, yet somehow managed to reshape it from within. Even in death, the empire acknowledged her extraordinary position. Hürrem was buried within the Süleymani Mosque complex in Istanbul, one of the greatest architectural masterpieces created by the legendary Ottoman architect Mimar Sinan. This mosque had been commissioned by Sultan Suleiman himself and completed only a year before her passing. The location of her tomb carried enormous meaning. No concubine in Ottoman history had ever received such an honor. Her burial beside the grand mosque built for Suleiman confirmed something that the empire could no longer deny. Hürrem Sultan had become a permanent part of the dynasty's legacy. 8 years later, in September of 1566, Sultan Suleiman himself died during a military campaign in Hungary at the siege of Szigety. Even in his final moments, the empire continued its long tradition of secrecy and discipline. His death was temporarily concealed from the army to prevent panic among the soldiers. But the question of succession could not be hidden forever. On September 7, 1566, their son Selim II became the new Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. The bloodline Hürrem had fought to secure now sat on the throne. Historians continue to debate the true nature of her influence. Venetian diplomats of the 16th century often described her as manipulative and dangerously ambitious. Ottoman chroniclers writing decades later sometimes portrayed her more carefully, emphasizing her intelligence and political awareness. Other records, including letters preserved in the archives of Topkapi Palace, reveal a different side of her life. Among these documents are dozens of personal letters exchanged between Hürrem and Suleiman during his military campaigns. These letters speak not of conspiracy or ambition, but of longing, fear, and affection. In one letter written during the Persian campaigns of the 1540s, she wrote words that have survived for centuries. She described herself simply as a woman whose only strength came from the affection of her husband and the need to protect their children in a dangerous world. These writings remind historians that the story of Hürrem Sultan cannot be reduced to a single explanation. She was a captive who survived a brutal system. She was a strategist who understood power better than many who were born into it. She was a mother protecting her children in an empire where survival often required impossible decisions. But perhaps her most lasting impact was something even larger. Before Hürrem Sultan, the women of the Ottoman harem existed largely in silence, separated from the public power of the empire. After her rise, the role of the Valid Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, became one of the most influential political positions within the Ottoman court. For generations, women of the dynasty would shape imperial decisions from behind the palace walls. The system had not been destroyed, but it had been permanently changed. And it all began with a girl whose name history once tried to erase.